Reactive training systems.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the RTS podcast. Today we are talking about pivot blocks. So before we really dig into this, I'm going to kind of lay out a little bit of background on what pivot blocks are and kind of the purpose behind it. So if you've not heard us talk at all about emerging strategies yet, that's probably a good place to start. We've got a video on our YouTube channel and on our podcast as well, where I do a presentation about emerging strategies, and I go into quite a bit of detail on how it's set up and the overall framework and structure of it. Pivot blocks are a specific kind of block that we use in emerging strategies. You can think of it like kind of like a Dload, kind of like a transition block in more traditional periodization parlance. But what we're trying to accomplish with a pivot block is a few different things. First, and this is kind of where it's connected to deloading. The first thing we're trying to accomplish is reducing the overall fatigue and really restoring the sensitivity to training. So the idea is that you, during your development cycle, you're training hard, and you gradually get desensitized to the training stimulus. It's the training stimulus over and over again, and you gradually get desensitized to that. If you're performing the same movements at relatively the same volumes and intensities every week, then that becomes a stimulus that your body is just a little bit less receptive to by the end of it. So we want to reduce the fatigue and restore that sensitivity. That's probably the main goal of the development cycle, because that's what sets you, the main goal of the pivot block, because that's what sets you up for the next development cycle. The second goal, I would say, is to maintain your strength. That's why we will include small doses of the competition lift, and we'll touch on that more in just a second. We can't really maintain 100% of your strength during the pivot block in most circumstances, but we want to maintain your strength as best we can while not interfering with the first goal, which is to restore your sensitivity and reduce the overall fatigue. And then the last goal is to increase your durability, reduce your incidence for injury, do all those things that you ought to do to improve your health and longevity, that you really don't have time to do during the course of a normal development cycle. All that stuff that you skip and that you wait, you delay, you tell yourself that you're going to do it before you go to bed or on your off days, but you really don't. So all that stuff gets put into the pivot block, which I would say if it was a normal deload week, a normal deload period, that would be inadequate, but because it's a pivot block, I think it works out all right. And that's probably the first question that I want to open it up to you guys as far as discussion. How long do you do a pivot block? I've said before that I think it should be roughly a third the length of your development cycle. So if your development cycle is 6 weeks, then your pivot is 2 weeks. So that makes up 25 to 30%, depending on the specifics. It's going to make up 25 to 30% of your overall training time. So that's not an insignificant amount of time. But for you guys, how do you tweak that? How do you individualize that? What indicators do you get that may make you want to make your pivot blocks longer or shorter or different in some way?
Well, I guess I'll go first here and just say I think it's very highly dependent on context. What the development block has looked like and the intensity of the development block and so forth. If it's sort of an off-season development block and a lot of that non-competitive lifts I mean, a lot of the exercises are further from the competition lifts anyway. Then maybe the pivot block doesn't need to be, needs to be structured in a way that is not radically different from the competition lifts. Whereas if it's leading right up to a competition, and I mean, it's a different thing. It's very, very contextual. Very.
Well, yeah. So like if you're in a pivot block that's going to lead into your last development cycle before a competition, that in that case, you need to resensitize yourself to training, but you also maintaining your strength takes on a little bit higher priority in that sense. So you're talking about prioritizing these three different goals and how that can shift around depending on what's going on. So if you just did a hypertrophy block, maybe you don't need to include a lot of alternate movement patterns and single leg work and stuff like that, because conceivably your hypertrophy block can include a lot of that stuff as well, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Awesome.
And the same thing with I think as far as the length of it goes as well.
Yeah. So kind of how much fatigue debt are you racking up?
Yeah. And that's kind of an individual thing, like we always say, you got to pay attention to your athlete. I mean, is this person, when they hit the end of a development block, still in good shape and everything, or are they really beat up and they really, need some more drastic measures taken?
Well, it's going to depend on recovery rate too, right? Like one thing that I've said before is that if you can't recover from it in 2 days, then you're dead. But I get the impression that that's something that you would disagree with pretty hard with, Mark. And that's fine too. That's something that honestly I haven't said much in the last couple of years, as my circumstances have changed as well. So, so the point being that recovery rate's going to vary a lot from lifter to lifter. So one of the ways that these goals kind of manifest into real pragmatic solutions to training, right? One thing that we see is that we tend to train the competition lift or some close variation. So take, for example, like if we're talking about the squat, you may not train your competition style low bar squat. A lot of times we'll opt for a high bar variation instead, because it's very close. It allows us to, tax the same muscles, use generally the same movement, but the weights are a little bit lighter, and it helps with that whole intensity reduction process. And as far as that intensity reduction goes, I know most of our lifters hate it, but they'll be training that for something like tens, right? But Ross, I know that in your specific case, we've gotten away from that in a pretty significant way. Again, depending on the context of the block. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? Like, what were some of the things that we noticed, and how do we know that change was more effective for you?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing was I felt like going into the new development block, or one development block to the next, my start and stop point were basically always the same. So there was like too much loss of strength, rather than starting at a slightly higher point than the previous block started at. So the thought was to reduce some of the reps to increase a little bit of the intensity to see if that would maintain some of the strength into the next blocks better, which so far I think it's favorable. I think there's still a little bit more time to fully flesh that out, with some other considerations with post Raw Nationals. We kind of did a bigger washout, and personal life has been pretty stressful lately. So there's kind of like some mixed results as far as what's working right now and what's not. But I know So like if you're not running 10s and you're running like 8s or 6s or something like that, the intensity is increased. So like because the intensity is increased, it's gonna take a little bit longer amount of time to decrease the excess fatigue and restore that sensitivity. So one of the things that I've been playing with I'll find out here in a few weeks with one of my lifters, timing wise, I needed to buy a week. So instead of using a maintenance block, I decided to opt for an additional pivot week, as she was also expressing that her hips were really beat up because we were trying to play with sumo and see how that would go for her compared to conventional. So instead of running 10s, we peeled it back and increased the intensity, but gave her an extra week. So hopefully we'll see how that goes, and what kind of strength maintenance occurs at the end of that.
Yeah, so it's this interesting juxtaposition between allowing that fatigue dissipation and resensitization to occur and maintaining the strength. So you've got to back off far enough that one thing can occur, but not so far that the other isn't maintained. So that's kind of the line that you're walking. And for me, kind of some of the things that I look for, it's I think mostly the same stuff that you were talking about, Ross. It's that if they seem like, they're losing so much during the pivot that the entire next development cycle, even if it's a very successful development cycle from a gain standpoint, is just spent regaining lost ground. Well, that's not where you want to be. You're losing too much strength in that case, right? Now, I tried something very similar at the same time that you did because we were both kind of noticing the same thing, right? We both noticed that, hey, we're doing these pivots. And in my case, my pivots are a bit stretched out just because I've got other stuff going on in life, travel and whatnot. It seems like if the pivot is supposed to be a third the length of your development cycle, mine tend to be like half the length of the development cycle, which is just too much, really. But you deal with it the way that you can. So I went into one pivot, and instead of doing something like 10s, which would be ideal from a standpoint of like intensity reduction and whatnot, I did 6s, which should tilt things more in favor of maintaining strength. And it worked from that standpoint. But the way that I can tell that it was too much is that my following development cycle really fizzled pretty badly. And if I look at past results and whatnot, it shouldn't have fizzled as badly as it did. The expectation is that it should have gone better, and it didn't. So, well, why is that? Well, it's hard to nail anything down with certainty, but my suspicion it was that the intensity was just too high in my pivot. 6s was too heavy, 10s was too light. So what I've done since then is I've tried to find the middle ground, which is mathematically 8s, right? And that seems to be working much better for me. So that's kind of how I've gone about dialing in that pivot to suit individual differences.
What about a potential mix of intensity? Like if you had an extended pivot block, and you ran a couple of weeks of 6s, and then the final week going into the new development block, you went back to the 10s.
That's an interesting idea. I haven't tried that yet. I don't see why that would be a bad thing, really. So like in the development cycle, you want to keep your stimulus the same so that you can gauge what the response is to. You're not constrained in the same way for your pivot blocks,
Right.
At least not that I can think of currently. So I don't see why that wouldn't work. That may be just the way to go about it. Like maybe the 6s allow you to maintain and restore a bit, but then that final week you can finish it up a little bit harder, and that might work even better. But see, that's the thing. It's like this test and retest concept, and that permeates all of it. The individual response varies, so you've got to test and retest. I have no doubt in my mind that that's a tactic that could work well for one person, but not really at all for someone else. So I'm just curious, is that something you just thought of, or have you tried that with some people?
It's something that I just thought of, but I'm also in a position where I could make the change and actually try that, which I think I will.
Yeah.
So one way to find out.
Another interesting twist that I guess is kind of unusual, but I've been running some of these half frequency programs. I mean, myself and another lifter or two, but that's another circumstance where it's maybe just a change, just the change itself, not so much in intensity or maybe a somewhat reduced volume, but just the change itself is enough to maintain strength. Like if you run a half frequency block for, I think last time we ran it 9 weeks or something like 9-10 weeks, 2-week pivot block, and then right back into another development block with very little strength loss, because the development block, by virtue of being half frequency, wasn't causing the accumulation of fatigue or whatever like a 1x frequency or 2x would.
I see what you're saying. So one thing, let me see if I can connect a few dots in my own mind here. One thing that a lot of people notice when they're training with really high frequencies is that they notice that the skill of the lift improves, but it also becomes more volatile, I think is a good word for it. So say that you start squatting every day. You'll notice that your skill and familiarity with squatting gets a lot better. But then if you take a day off, that goes away, not entirely, but that you lose the edge a little bit, and if you let me think of how to say this. It's like gains that are made through high frequency exposure require high frequency exposure to be maintained, something like that, So what I hear you saying is that if you did something like a longer development cycle of half frequency, that you're making gains that are not contingent on that high frequency exposure, and then you've seen it survive the pivot a little bit more intact. Is that pretty close?
Yeah, that's probably, maybe what you're saying is that part of the gains with the high frequency are technical gains, and part of the gains, or more, let's say, more shifted towards technical gains, whereas half frequency or lower frequency would be more shifted towards just general strength gains. So those general strength gains might be easier to maintain until the next development block, just by using a pivot block where you're changing up movements but still trying to maintain the strength.
You see, I don't know. So we're I don't know what I think about this right now, because there's kind of a fine line to walk as far as the technical side of things, right? That exposure to high frequencies of training, like let's say you're training the competition lift with a high frequency, then that's frequent exposure to the same mechanic, right? But in a 1/2 frequency, it may be the same pattern frequency, but there's more variation. So you wouldn't squat as frequently, but you might, if you included like pin squats and pause squats and all the other squat variations, it may be the same amount of frequency. So that's what I mean. Like if we make a distinction between the pattern, how frequently is the pattern trained versus the specific movement itself. And if we make that distinction, I'm not convinced that a high movement specific frequency is the best way to hone and refine your technique. I think that it works great up to a point, but I think having the variations in the movement are important to things like motor learning and motor coordination. So we're talking more about like nervous system types of adaptations now, and really I'm kind of thinking back to some of the conversations that we've had offline about Franz Bosch and some of his thoughts about technical development. So if you train, it's the same concept that we use for like weak range of motion correction, right? Say that you've got somebody that exhibits the chest fall pattern in the squat, so you have them pin squat, or you have them high bar squat, or safety bar squat, something like that. It's essentially the same movement. The pillars of squatting are still there, but we've tweaked it slightly so that it rewards correct patterns and punishes incorrect patterns, so that it can help with technical learning. Now, of course, that has to be translated back into the competition exercise itself, So anyway, I'm really veering off track here, but I guess that would say, to kind of tie this back to pivots and everything else. I think maybe it's a nervous system adaptation. Maybe the higher frequency is a nervous system adaptation, and the lower, talking about microcycle frequency now, like, because you were talking about half frequency, and we really ought to come up with some different terms to better distinguish, pattern frequencies and microcycle frequencies and all that. But you were talking about 1/2 frequency, that maybe that's got more of a morphological effect, and the higher microcycle frequency, the 1x frequency, would have more of a neurological effect. I don't know. That I'm just kind of thinking about that off the top of my head here.
Yeah, I think we're kind of saying the same thing, just using different terminology.
Yeah, I think so.
I got a question for you, Mark, on that too, with the half frequency and how it ties to the pivot block, and how it sounds like your pivot block length is reduced when you're doing the half frequency microcycle, correct?
No. Well, yes. Okay. Yes. If we're going by the 1/3 rule, let's say, a 9 or 10 week long half frequency block, I've only been using 2-week pivot blocks, where if you went by that rule, it'd be 3 weeks. Right. So
I guess the question I had for that too is, then when you're running the half frequency microcycle, I'm thinking you can get away with a reduced, call it calendar length of a pivot block. I would assume probably because either maybe there's a less total amount of stress per week during that half frequency, or maybe the exercises are a little less ballistic, for lack of a better word, like they're not beating you up as much.
Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Well, go ahead, Mike. I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, one thing that I've noticed, almost regardless of frequency, is that I think our 1/3 rule kind of falls apart a little bit out at some extreme development cycle lengths. So now we've said before that most commonly we see development cycles taking 5 or 6 weeks, and the further you go away from that, the less common it is. 3 weeks is kind of a minimum, I think. But as far as a maximum, I've had some people go, 8, 9, 10 weeks on the same stimulus, So at 10 weeks, if you're using the 1/3 rule, you really ought to be taking a 3-week pivot, but that's difficult for a lot of powerlifters to swallow. You're going to take almost a month off. Well, it's like, well, look, in the grand scheme of things, considering that your development cycle is almost 3 months, that's not too much to ask, but it's difficult for people psychologically. So I've opted more for a 2-week pivot, unless it gets real silly, and we're doing like a 12-week development cycle, which I haven't really had. Then, I've been able to get by with 2-week pivots, even out at some of those more extreme lengths.
Yeah, and I guess to answer your question, Ross, basically, let me see, how can I put this? Instead of having, let's say, instead of, say you're on a 4-day-a-week program, you got 12 exercise slots. If you go to half frequency, now you got 24 exercise slots, to work with. So
Right.
you can work in a lot of different variation, and you can hit a lot of the things that you normally wouldn't be able to hit during normal development block. And so there's a lot more variety, and you're not hammering one specific thing so hard that after whatever 5-6 weeks, whatever your normal development cycle length is, you're pretty much, the wheels are about to come off. And so I don't know how to verbalize this really. It's like when you get to I haven't hit the end of a half frequency development block yet. I don't know where that is. We've just run, I think, 9 or 10 weeks and then had to change things up because, there's a meet coming up. So I don't know how long we can run, but I do know, my normal 1X development block length is 5 weeks. We went well beyond that and still making good gains.
That's important to note too, right? Like, so by the numbers, if we just are counting exposures to a stimulus, if you're 5 weeks to peak on a 1X microcycle frequency, you ought to take about 10 weeks. Now we know that it's not exactly that, right? Like if I had to guess, it would be that, if I was going to guess without knowing anything, I would have guessed around 8 or 9 weeks, and if you've gone that long, I don't know, man, it seems like you've got to be reaching near the end. But that's one of the problems with those lower frequencies. It becomes unwieldy to manage, right? Like,
Right.
Like you're saying, you don't even really know where the end is at, because who has, almost, who has between 3 and 4 months of uninterrupted training time where nothing goes wrong, nothing goes off plan. You don't have something pop up in the middle of it, so it gets a little bit unwieldy to manage. So that's what I've had whenever I've had lifters go out that far. I like to at least trial some higher frequencies, so if it's a 1X frequency that pushes us out to 8 or 9 weeks, then we'll try a 2X frequency and see how they respond to that. Now, you can manage the stress so that the stress isn't crushing them at a 2X frequency, and you should do that. But having the higher frequency of exposure should get the peak to happen a bit sooner, and it becomes a little bit easier to manage, Yeah, those long blocks can be difficult.
I'll have lifters that do really well with like 4X, just 4-week developmental blocks, and they'll run those for a while, and we'll do a 4-week developmental block, a 1-week washout, and sometimes the washouts are quite specific, and especially as we get closer to a competition, I like the washouts to be a bit more specific. Whereas when we're, in off season, whatever that means, if it's 4 weeks out from a meet, maybe we'll have a more or a less specific washout week or pivot block, let's call it. And with the pivots, eventually they get a bit like if they have let's say five successful developmental blocks, eventually they'll get a bit demotivated to train. At some point, every one of my lifters gets a bit demotivated to train, whether it takes 2 years, 1 year, 3 years. And as that happens, sometimes that means the blocks need to be a bit longer. And I find like understanding the lifter's motivation and where they're at mentally helps me to decide how long even the developmental blocks will be. Sometimes optimal performance is not necessarily as important if it means that by the end of the developmental block they're fatigued so much and they're so demotivated to train that they don't even get to the end. I don't have a lot of lifters with this experience yet, but I have had a few, and I find that to be kind of an interesting phenomenon in determining pivot block lengths.
That's a good point, actually. I like that idea. And you touch on something that I think is important to reiterate is just kind of what it's like when you reach the end of a development cycle. One thing that I've noticed, and I've told this story before, but I've noticed when we were first starting emerging strategies, I was concerned that people were going to get bored. It's the same microcycle repeated. At least at a fundamental level. That's how it always starts. And I thought, man, that's the same training over and over. People are going to get bored and not want to do it. But I haven't had that experience. What does seem to happen is that as long as the development cycle is going well, then people are motivated. You're a powerlifter, for God's sake. You tend not to mind doing the same thing over and over again. Otherwise, this isn't really your sport. And as long as things are going well, then things are going well. But when you reach the end of that development cycle and you have the peak, then it's like a very sudden onset of a loss of motivation. Just kind of your willingness to train drops. That's what it feels like subjectively to me too. I know when things are good, and then I'll hit the peak and it's like very suddenly it's like, I don't want to do this anymore. So those pivots are critical to helping restore the motivation to train. And that's a weird experience too, because when you return to training after your pivot, that's when motivation is high. And then, that first week you go back in there and there is a little bit of a loss of strength because you try to maintain your strength, but your priorities, resensitization and all that. So strength does go down a little bit. It has to. You have to come off of that peak a little bit. So that first week you're motivated to get back in the gym, but then all the weights are down, and that's kind of a bummer too. But the rest of the time in the middle, you can focus on your improvement, and that seems to be very motivating.
Yeah, and that what you were just saying, Jim, that's one of my lifters, John Norcott. He kind of hit that point where he's been pushing so hard so long that he pretty much got burned out, and we switched off to I've got him on a half frequency now, and he's killing it and he loves it because you only, he's not doing basically any, he's doing close variations of the competition lifts, but no competition lifts per se. And when you have to do the competition lifts only once every 2 weeks, your attitude is way different, and the funny thing is, this is what I've been doing for a while now, where I would put, say, 5 kilos, add 5 kilos every week to my squat, say. Now I go 2 weeks and I add 10 kilos instead. So it's the same gains, I don't know.
That's interesting, and I think there's connections there to how Westside conducts their max effort training. and how they cycle through these exercises, and they may only come back to it, every 2 months, but it does make it a much bigger deal. It's the same thing with Shaco's style of training and how they only really touch 90% work, maybe once every 3 months or something like that. It makes it a much bigger deal if you do it less frequently. So I feel like there must be some sort of personality connection in there too. How frequently do you need to be exposed to this stimulus? Like how, and it's probably multifactorial as well. It's probably not just related to conscientiousness or neuroticism or one thing. Like it's probably got multiple connections. But how frequently do you need to be exposed to that stimulus for it to be kind of optimal training? Because you've got to balance the arousal, and also balance the skill. If you're doing it every day and you're basically just dreading it, like, oh man, I've got to go do this thing again, and it gets boring and tedious and repetitive, and those are not good things for your training. So what's the ideal balance? Every 2 weeks, every 8 weeks, every 3 months. There's no way that is a universal answer. It has to be individualized.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Again, a good example, Ryan Stills. I know how Ryan is. If he sees an Instagram post, he's going to try to compete against it. It's just like, so, I can't throw too much intensity at him because he can't last. He gets beat up. He just goes at it too hard. So that's totally
kind of like you then.
Beg your pardon?
So he's kind of like you then.
Yeah, that's how I can relate.
Yeah.
I also have lifters who just want to get freaking strong, and they just, the washout weeks are almost more stressful for them, even though, they hit the peak or whatever. They're just ready to go. They're like, okay, yeah, I know I hit the peak, but I'm ready. And a particular lifter has about a 6-week developmental. And because of this quality that he has, it's usually a 1-week washout, because otherwise he's just like, what are you doing? Like, I don't know why we haven't started yet. And we've tried the 2-week washout, but he also seems to respond negatively. Like his strength will be a lot further down than if we just run a 1-week washout. So we've been doing that, or pivot. We've been doing that, and it's been pretty helpful to just like listen to him a little bit more and just, okay, if you're ready to go, then let's go.
Yeah, it definitely is something that needs to be individualized. And like I said, this 1/3 thing tends to fall apart at longer cycle lengths. It's a heuristic, so it's a thing that has to get individualized as well. And to be honest, I don't know that it falls apart at longer cycle lengths because there haven't been that many people that I've worked with that are, taking, 9-10 weeks to peak, where I can really test that idea out. The couple that I've had go that far do seem to still be just fine with a 2-week pivot, but like Jim, what you're talking about, you have somebody at a 6-week development block, a classic case of having a 2-week pivot. Well, if they don't need it, it's not even if they don't need it. If they respond negatively to it, then don't do it. The whole idea here is following the lifter response. The only wrong answer is to not follow the lifter response. If you respond well to low intensity work and poorly to high intensity work, why would you lead into your competition with something that you respond poorly to just because that's the way things ought to be done? Well, that doesn't make any sense. Following the lifter response is the right answer. So everything else is a rule of thumb and a guideline. So obviously you're going about it the right way there.
It gives you a starting point to start collecting the data that you need for the process of individualization, because it takes time to expose the lifter to different stimulus and different things to see for those patterns to start to emerge, and we adapt our strategies based on those emerging statistics.
Sure. Well, we've touched on a couple things here. We've touched on off season in a couple different ways. Jim, you were talking about something off season a little bit more directly. Mark, you were talking about your work with John Norcott and how you've kind of used the 1/2 frequency development cycle setup to reduce how often he's exposed to the competition lifts, which is kind of a way of getting at the off season, right? Would you agree with that? It's like strength focused, but it's less about the competition skill. It's hitting on that a lot less, so it's kind of off season.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gives you an opportunity to really work on the weak ranges of motion and stuff like that you wouldn't otherwise have.
There's a lot, like you said, you've basically doubled your number of exercise slots in a case like that. So it does give you a chance to do a lot more things. I wonder if it doesn't also cloud the signal a little bit. And I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head here. If you're wondering how well you respond to, a one board press, if one board press is the only assistance exercise in the program, you're going to get a better picture of that versus if, there are 5 other exercises in the program as well, So that would be one thing that I would think about running the 1/2 frequency stuff. It may take a little bit longer to figure out some of those specifics, but I mean, at the same time, the way that this works is kind of a whole strategy response anyway. So it's not like you respond to this exercise and that exercise and stuff like that. It's kind of a whole stimulus packaged together. Like that's what the microcycle is, and whether it takes 2 days or 2 weeks, like it's still one stimulus. So you're kind of pushing that whole thing. And what we're doing with the block review process is to look for similarities there. So anyway, I'm thinking while I'm talking. So hopefully it's not too random and confusing.
I don't think so. I think the emerging strategies as a whole, honestly, like if you think about it, like your thought process just there, like that's kind of what the emerging strategies is. It's like everything's just emerging and you have to figure out what to do with it. And the randomness is only random if you don't track it. Like it's only kind of random, like, oh, I threw in this exercise, but I didn't think about it much. Like the difference in between, like you can't do this without the data tracking. You just can't. And so the pivot blocks too, like you might think, oh, it's a pivot block. It doesn't really matter how we set it up because it's not the developmental block, but it does more often than not really affect how the developmental block works and the success of it. So like it might feel random. You're just throwing a bunch of new exercises. As long as it's different, it should work. But in reality, there's so much within that you can control and you can actually test for, which it's just kind of an interesting observation, I guess, there.
Yeah, and it is definitely a second level testing and observation process, right? So the development cycles are a little bit easier to figure out, right? You have this microcycle and you repeat it and you're tracking your results and your results either went up or they didn't. Like that's easy to figure out. The pivots are kind of a second order stimulus because they're not going to lead to any direct progress themselves. The only way that you're going to be able to tell if it was effective or ineffective is by watching the next development cycle, and in that way, it's kind of like some other second order emerging properties of your program. So some other things that are kind of at that level. When you start talking about block sequences, hey, I respond to high intensities on my bench, but I respond really great to high intensities on my bench if it's preceded by this kind of development cycle. Like if you start to notice those things, that's that second order observation. A pivot block, really dialing in the kind of pivot and the things that need to be included, that's that second order observation as well. It makes it a lot harder to figure out, but we're talking about something that's going to directly impact how successful the next development cycle is. So it's clearly important.
Yeah. I think this topic is really interesting because, distinguishing, actually get a lot of questions on the difference between a deload and a pivot, and Mike, maybe you can talk a little bit more about this, but it seems like the deload is less of a specifically targeted, deviation from the norm, whereas a pivot is very calculated, very specific, and definitely related to the next block. It's more or less semantics, I guess, but maybe you guys can talk about this a little bit too.
Well, it's partly semantic, but I think there's a bit more to it than just that. To me, a deload is about reducing fatigue. You're there to reduce fatigue. You maybe do a little bit of training. A lot of people these days will include a little bit of training in their deload, but it's really designed for some kind of maintenance, and it varies. If we're talking about technical maintenance or strength maintenance or something, but that's about it. I think a pivot goes a bit further in that although restoring sensitivity and reducing fatigue, that's the number one goal of the pivot block. That's something that your body's going to do anyway. That's something that your body does. You don't do it. This is an automatic process. So the second goal is to maintain your strength. That's something that we can spend some training on, but I guess it's interesting that we've spent the majority of this time talking about those first two goals, and it makes sense. Those are the high priority goals. But if you look at the pivot training itself, the kinds of things that we write into a pivot, most of the training time is spent on that third goal, which is improving your durability, reducing incidences of future injury, balancing your body out a bit, improving other things like aerobic capacity. Maybe that's a thing that we've identified that is going to help you develop better as a lifter. Well, aerobic capacity work is a great thing to put into a pivot.
Yeah, and good example of that is say if you're typical, well, as myself as an example, because just if my typical development block work volume is say 50, 60,000 pounds, a deload might be 25,000, but I've had pivot blocks that were over 100,000. And you look at that and say, holy crap, that's no kind of a deload, but really, the objective was totally different.
Sure. And it's directed at different things, different patterns, done at much lower intensity. It's a lot of volume, but the intensity has to get accounted for there, or otherwise it can be a higher volume but less stress.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the point, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I've started to come across a bunch of different things that I like to include in my pivots that I write that do seem to be helpful. The tempo work is another thing that people hate, but I think is good for them. We'll do like a 5-3-0 tempo where it's 5-second eccentric, then a 3-second pause in the stretch position, and then 0 on the way up. So that makes for some pretty interesting deadlifts, just because it's not the way that you would normally do a deadlift at all, but so the weight is super light, right? But that's we started doing that to better balance the strength and elasticity between the tendons and the muscles. And I mean, I haven't kept any statistics on our incidences of muscle belly injuries or anything like that, but my sense is it seems to have helped, you know. Now, whether it's that work specifically or the fact that we're, you know, spending more time than we used to on lower stress training loads, you know, I don't know. But if athletes are getting hurt less, then that's more time that they're spending getting stronger. It's a self-justifying thing, you know?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, guys, I think we're running short on time. I know that we've got to get moving on to another thing here, but is there any kind of last round of comments, advice, observations that you guys want to make regarding pivots? Jim, I think that was key there about the distinction between a pivot and a deload. That's a question that comes up a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just understanding that, especially with the emerging strategies, a lot of this is new terminology and new information, and we have different ways of accomplishing things that were used, you know, a little bit differently in traditional styles of periodization. So, like, I don't know, I just hope that this podcast is helping other people understand, like, all the tools that we're using right now and developing the emerging strategies process. Because I don't know, it's really just game changing, I think. So hopefully that's not patting ourselves too much on the back, but
no, it's definitely changed how I go about writing training, and we're talking about a scenario where all of us have skin in the game here. You know, we're all coaching lifters at all levels, really, you know, from probably low novice is probably as far down as most of us go in an online setting, all the way up to the best lifters in the world. So if this is a strategy that sucks, you know, we're the ones paying the price for it. But I really don't think that's the case. You know, in fact, I've got plenty of evidence that points the other way. So, yeah, second you on that one, Jim. All right, guys. Well, thanks for sitting in. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on pivot work. If anybody listening to this has any questions on this or anything that you'd like us to cover in a future roundtable, please let us know. You know, feel free to reach out to me in any of the myriad of ways that you can do so. Instagram, Facebook, email, on the Reactive Training Systems website. You can send us messages through that as well. So let us know what you think. Let us know what you want us to cover in the future. Happy training, and we'll talk to you next time.
Reactive Training Systems.